Hello, welcome to today's live stream. My name is Elizabeth Gleaney at INCLUDEnyc, a New York City-based organization that works with families that have children and youth with disabilities. Our live stream today will focus on gender development, expression, and play in young children. Every month, INCLUDEnyc hosts a live stream presentation. Those are aired on the third Thursday of each month at noon. Today's presentation will run for less than 60 minutes. During this live stream, we will use the chat box. So if you have any questions, please feel free to chat us and we'll do our best to answer your questions. Now for today's guest. Megan Pamela Ruth Madison works with the New York Early Childhood Professional Development Institute at CUNY and is a doctoral student at Brandeis University. Welcome, Megan.
Thank you.
So excited to have you join us today and really looking forward to our conversation.
Me too.
Our main objectives for today's conversation are to discuss when and how children develop an understanding of gender, as well as some strategies that families and professionals can use to avoid the perpetuation of harmful gender stereotypes while encouraging comfort and respect for children's own bodies and other people's bodies. We'll also touch on ways to make your home or classroom a safe space for the development and exploration of children's identity. Finally, Megan will share some approaches for working with family members who are struggling with other children's gender nonconforming dress or behavior. So without further ado, let's get started and hear from our expert, Megan. So Megan, can you tell us a little bit about you and your background?
Sure. My name is Megan. My full name is Megan Pamela Ruth Madison. It's a little bit of a mouthful, so you don't have to refer to me using my whole name. Megan is fine. And actually, I had one parent who grew up in the South, one parent who grew up in the North. So my dad called me Megan, my mom called me Megan, so you don't actually have to worry about pronunciation with me. I respond to anything.
Great.
But when you're not using my first name, the gender pronouns that feel respectful and affirming to me are she and her and hers. And I have the awesome job. I have, in my opinion, the best job in the world.
Great.
I get to go around to different schools, mostly early childhood programs, and talk to teachers about racism and sexism, heteronormativity, breaking down what those words mean, and how those systems of oppression have impacted our lives and impact the lives of the children and the families that we work with.
That's great. So I know you spoke a little bit about the pronouns that you use. Can you tell our audience a little bit about why that's important information to share and why that's relevant?
Yes, thank you so much for pausing there. I think I am working, and lots of other people are working, to normalize the use of sharing our pronouns rather than having to rely on assumptions.
Great.
And so one way you can do it is when you're introducing your name, you can also share the pronouns that you prefer to go by. When I facilitate workshops, for example, and also teachers can do this, you could also do it in your home, is to, when you meet a new person, share your pronouns and then ask another person how they prefer to be referred to. And the reason we do it is that in everyday conversation, we often just look at a person and make a lot of assumptions about how they want to be referred to. And a lot of times those assumptions are accurate, and so we just kind of go on with our lives. Sometimes those assumptions are inaccurate. And when those assumptions are inaccurate, it can cause harm to folks.
Yeah.
And so just like we want to learn how to pronounce a person's name so that can feel respectful and affirming to them, we also want to make sure that we're using pronouns when we're talking about them that feel respectful and affirming.
I think that's a great example and to model. My pronouns are also she and hers. Is that how someone would use that sort of language?
Sure. Yeah. Right. And of course, it's always an invitation to share. It's never a requirement.
Right.
And so, and there's also no right or wrong when it comes to pronouns. Everybody's the expert. So some common ones are she and her. Others are he and him. There's also a whole suite of new gender neutral or gender expansive pronouns. And when in doubt, you can always use they or them as a gender neutral pronoun.
That's great. Thanks for sharing that. I think that's really important information.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about what brought you to this kind of work that you've been doing?
What a good question. So in some way, I've been doing this work my whole life.
Okay.
But more formally, I started teaching preschool in Chicago a little, I want to say almost 10 years ago now. Wow, time flies. As I was teaching preschool, I got to know a lot of really awesome 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds.
Cool.
And they asked me really good questions about big things that were unfair in the world. And I actually had at that time a master's degree in early childhood education, and still I felt really unprepared. I didn't know how to appropriately answer those questions for young children. I didn't know what vocabulary to use. I didn't know where to go. And I did actually find one. I remember this book. It's called Antibias Education for Young Children and Ourselves. There's actually a new version coming out pretty soon with an updated gender chapter.
Great.
So if anyone's interested, check that out. And that book really got me started on a big journey about thinking how race, gender, culture, class, ability, all of these things had really impacted my own life and were clearly impacting my teaching. And so then naively I thought, well, maybe I should get a PhD. If a master's degree didn't answer these questions, maybe a PhD is where I would go. So I moved to Boston and started a PhD program. And I did get access to lots of books and theories and research. But I was really missing the application piece. I was missing actual kids, actual families, real programs. And so I started working part-time, facilitating workshops for teachers on race and racism.
Great.
And I loved it. I thought it was awesome work. And then a few years into that process, I was contacted by a person named Katie Schaefer, who was working for the New York Early Childhood Professional Development Institute on a series of workshops for preschool teachers, more specifically on gender and sexuality and family diversity. And so Katie brought me on. And at first I was like, oh, I only know a little bit about gender, like race and racism is really my wheelhouse. But Katie was like, no, you've got this. I think you can handle it. Like, also part of the process is like learning and making mistakes. Yeah. And I did really know about facilitating professional development for teachers. And so, I think maybe about the last 3 or 4 years, I've been facilitating these workshops on gender and sexuality and family diversity, mostly for preschool teachers, sometimes for families. And now we have a whole team of awesome trainers who go out all around New York City, New York State. Sometimes we travel even further to support teachers and families in thinking about these topics.
That's really great and really important work. So one follow-up question to that is, I know you mentioned gender and sex and sexuality. Could you talk a little bit about what the difference is between those terms? Should we use them interchangeably?
Such a good question. And also for this question, we do have a handout.
Oh, great.
So for anyone who's watching, there's the handout packet. There should be a link. And also if you registered, it should be in your email. But we're going to flip open to a handout that was created by some folks at a project called Gender Justice in Early Childhood. They're based out of California, and they're wonderful. I know them because we are a part of a national network of early childhood professionals really thinking about gender justice called the GLECN, Gender Liberation in Early Childhood Network. And there's lots more resources on their website. But for now, we're going to open up to this handout that is kind of hard to see. But on the upper left-hand corner, it says gender boxes.
Right.
And so the core thing to know here, I guess let's start with sex. Or biological sex or sex assigned at birth.
Right.
A lot of folks, myself included, grew up with a model of sex being a binary. That there are 2 ways that human bodies can be. They can either have penises or they can have vaginas. They can either have XX chromosomes or XY chromosomes. They can either have certain hormones or other hormones. Right. And it turns out that's actually too simplistic of a story. Right. There's lots of ways that human bodies can be. And often many of us, like for myself, I actually don't even know what my chromosomes are. They've never been tested. Right. But I do know that when I was born, a doctor looked at my body, and in particular, they looked at my secondary sex characteristics. Right. So they looked at my genitalia, and they said, wow, that baby body has a vagina. Right. And so we are going to assign that baby body the sex of female. Okay. And that happens every single day to lots of baby bodies. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about biological sex.
Okay.
It's like the sex that you're assigned based on your body. Also acknowledging that there's even more than just two ways for bodies to be. Gender then is a bigger, more complicated question because it encompasses both our identity, like who we know ourselves to be, which may or may not correspond to the assumptions that people made about us based on our body. It also includes our expression, how we communicate to the world who we are and what we like.
Okay.
And it also encompasses a whole host of expectations that a given society has about how people are supposed to be in society in order to conform to those particular gender norms. So to break that down a little bit more, we can look at this gender boxes here. So in our particular society, which is just one society, it is not all societies.
Right.
There's lots of other societies in different places and different times that have organized and made up a gender system in very different ways.
Right.
But in our particular society, we have this, what we call the gender binary. There's two options. There's the boy option and then there's the girl option. And in the boy option, there's a whole host of expectations about things you're supposed to do and be and want in society based on gender, right? So we have, you're probably assumed to be referred to as he. There's assumptions about what your body's supposed to look like. There's assumptions about who you might be attracted to romantically or sexually when you grow up. There's expectations about how you handle emotions, for example. Like boys are often told, boys don't cry. Or man up. There's assumptions about what you're going to like to do, whether you're going to like to play with trucks versus playing with dolls, for example. And then if you're put in the girl box, there's a whole other host of assumptions. What are some, I feel like I've been talking about, what are some assumptions as a fellow person who's been put in the girl box? What are some assumptions you're aware of about expectations for girls?
I think for girls, there's the expectation that girls are softer, more emotional, more willing to talk about their feelings, more open about their feelings versus people who are typically classified as being a boy. I also think it's really interesting because you see this start to play out even when kids are infants in terms of the messaging that's on their clothing and the things that we give to small children as toys, that this is a toy that's for a boy because it's a truck or a train. This is a toy that's for a girl because it's a doll or a mop or a hairbrush or something like that. And so I think about that as well when I think about this sort of gender box idea.
Totally. You just made me think about like children's toothbrushes. A toothbrush is the thing that all people need.
It's true.
Like, it's not a gendered item.
It's true.
And yet, when you go into the children's toothbrush aisle, there's one that is blue with cars on it, and is clearly socially expected for boys. And there's another toothbrush that's pink and purple and has Barbies on it, and that's expected for girls. So it's amazing, like how deep these gendered expectations get mapped onto everything, from toys to even things like toothbrushes.
They make gendered pacifiers. When I was when we were registering, when we had our son, one of the things we saw was that there are different sets of pacifiers that are marketed for girls and for boys. And the girls' pacifiers were pink and purple. The boys' pacifiers were blue and green. And they had different little like icons on them as well.
Yeah, what a powerful example.
Starts early.
It starts very, very early, often even before a child is born. Right? One of the first questions that many people get when they communicate to the world that they're pregnant or expecting a baby in some way is it a boy or is it a girl? Right? Which is such a complicated question. We don't know that baby yet, how they will identify. We haven't yet met them. And even if we do have some clues about their body, it certainly doesn't tell us a whole lot of other things about who that person is going to become. But gender is such a salient and important way that our society categorizes people that it makes it a question that we start asking very early, even before we've ever met a human being, before they've even come into the world.
It's really true.
So we've got this rigid gender system that says there's certain things for boys, certain things for girls. That then, to break it down, some folks created this thing called the gender bread model. There's also a gender unicorn model you can find online. And this model helps us break apart some of the different pieces that get mushed together inside this gender box model. So here we see gender identity with the brain symbol. Our gender identity is who we know ourselves to be.
Okay.
And so, for example, I know I'm a girl, not because someone told me I'm a girl, not because of the parts of my body. So, for example, if my body changes over time, it's not going to make me less of a girl.
Right.
Right? Like who I know I am is an internal thing. That's my gender identity.
Okay.
And this model has it on a spectrum, right? One could identify on one spectrum as end of the spectrum as a boy, or the other end of the spectrum as a girl. Or anywhere in between. It's not a 2-option thing. It's you could identify anywhere on that spectrum. Our identity is a separate construct from our gender expression. And here they have that as like the outline of us.
Right.
And our gender expression is how we communicate to the world about our gender. And that, again, is on a spectrum from masculine on one end to feminine on the other end, and an infinite number of options in between. Our gender identity and our gender expression are also different from our biological sex, like we were talking about, where the sex is assigned at birth.
Right.
And so our biological sex might be on one end of the spectrum male, the other female, or anywhere in between. And then completely different from all of those things is our sexual orientation, who we're attracted to, right? We might be attracted to people of the same gender. We might be attracted to people of different genders. And that, again, is on a spectrum. And all of us have our own gender story. Like, for example, I might look through that and go, okay, I know I identify strongly and pretty consistently as a girl, all the way on the right at that spectrum. In terms of my gender expression, it might be like towards the feminine end, but not all the way, right? Like, depending on the context and how safe I feel, and on a given day, I might feel somewhere in between, somewhere between the midpoint of the spectrum and feminine. In terms of biological sex, again, I was assigned female at birth. And in terms of my sexual orientation, this is where we get the spectrums breaking down. So this, again, is one framework. It is useful to the extent that it is useful, and it is not like truth. So for me, I identify as pansexual, or attracted to people of all genders, and that doesn't really fit neatly on this spectrum. And so I might put an X somewhere outside of the spectrum.
Okay.
So any person can go through and figure out your own gender story. And there's no right or wrong when it comes to it.
Okay.
Our society expects everything to align on one end of the spectrum or the other, but this allows us a little bit more flexibility in between. What else is worth noticing on this? The limitations of this. There are many, but one is that it's still on a spectrum.
Right.
So it says boys on one side, girls on the other side. And it turns out, and they're completely separate. And actually, there's some interplay between these things and our lived experience. So now we're moving toward this model of gender expansiveness. And gender expansiveness understands that gender is complex.
Right.
Meaning that it's not simple and straightforward. It's dynamic, which means that it can change over space and over time, and we want to normalize that. So just because I identify at one part of that spectrum this morning doesn't mean I'm going to stay there throughout the day. Doesn't mean that I'm going to stay there throughout my lifetime, that there's room to change and experiment and explore over time. That it's individually determined, so that we, again, are every individual person is the expert of their own gender. It's still separate from sexual orientation. So gender and sexual orientation are related, but not the same thing. And it's intersectional, meaning that it's related to other identities. So the way that my gender is perceived, the way that my gender is expressed is connected to my culture, my class, my racial identity, that they're kind of inseparable. They're woven together. But the basic story here, if you get nothing else, is that it's way more complicated than just 2 options.
Okay. I think that's really good information. to have. It's a lot of information.
It's a lot of
Yeah.
information. Yeah. So also, there's lots of books and resources, and we could spend the rest of our lives exploring it and breaking it down. So if anyone in the live stream is being like, "Whoa, that was a lot! You just blew my mind," that is okay. Sit with that feeling, and I invite you to explore. We'll share lots more resources for you to continue thinking about your gender, what gender means in our society. You don't have to figure it all out in one day.
That's good. So thinking about gender, when and how do children tend to develop an understanding of gender?
Great. So the next handout if you flip a couple more pages, there's actually a really nifty developmental timeline. And a caveat I always give with every developmental timeline is that it's helpful to the extent that it's helpful, but every individual child is different. So if your child or yourself don't fit neatly on this timeline, don't automatically go, "Oh no, I'm broken, something's wrong." Every person is different. These are just some, when we look at lots and lots of kids, what are some trends we typically see?
Right.
And so I think typically we know when we look at research that most kids are beginning to categorize individuals by gender and starting to pick up that gender is a salient social category by age 1 in the first year of life, which is probably unsurprising, given that there are gendered pacifiers and gendered toys and gendered clothes, gendered language. It makes sense that kids before their first year of life are starting to understand and categorize things by gender. Then we see at about 18 months, typically kids are starting to understand their own gender identity and are beginning to be able to express that and say, "This is who I am." And by 2, we're starting to see more consistently that children are able to use kind of culturally defined gendered labels. Girl, boy, for example, they're able to communicate an awareness that their gender identities may be incompatible with the sex that they were assigned. So that's when kids are starting to tell us, "Hey, I think grown-ups, you might have gotten this wrong." Or, "Hey, grown-ups, yep, you got this right." And they're also beginning to notice gender stereotypes. And then definitely by 3 and 4, we're seeing that kids not only understand their own gender and are communicating about gender, but they're also starting to internalize the big gender stereotypes that we have in our society. So they're starting to internalize, unless it's interrupted, a sense that there are only 2 options. And then also they're starting to internalize what we call sexism or patriarchy, the cultural notions that things associated with men and boys and masculinity are more valuable than things associated with women and girls and femininity.
So sort of a follow-up question to that. If you are a parent or a teacher working with a child and you think based on what the child looks like and what's been reported that the child is a boy, but the child says, "I think I'm actually a girl," how should you respond to that? Should you encourage? Should you tell them that they're incorrect? How would you recommend that someone work in that sort of situation?
I think for that, it's really helpful for me to go back to like the Gender Liberation and Early Childhood Network, that network I was talking about. We have a list of kind of core beliefs. And one core belief is in child agency, that children know who they are and they're the expert in who they are. And that grown-ups, it's our job to support and affirm children. And to listen to them when they tell us who they are. And so I would say in that situation, listen to your child. 1, because it's the right thing to do. 2, because it supports their development. And 3, because if you push against what a child is telling you, it's not likely to work. You know, we can think of it in big ways in gender, but also like in pretty simple ways, right? Like if your child at 2 knows they don't like bananas and is telling you, "I don't like bananas," you're not going to get them to like bananas by forcing them to eat bananas. It's just not, that's not how that works.
It's not going to work.
It's not going to work. What you might do if you try to force your child to like bananas is they'll stop trusting you. Because they feel like you're not listening to them. And they might lose hope in trying to, that you're a safe person to tell them who they are and what they like. And they might have to find support from other human beings
Right.
and other grown-ups who are going to actually support and affirm them. And so the agency we do have as adults, we don't have agency to change kids in who they are, but we do have agency in choosing to really listen and honor and affirm kids when they're telling us who they are and what they want.
I think that's great advice. That's what I do with my son, although he has not yet said anything about, if he thinks he's a boy or a girl. But, giving him a wide variety of toys, letting him choose different colors that he wants to wear. So, I think there are things like that you can do to respect your child's agency even before they're able to say,
yes,
I'm a boy or I'm a girl, but letting them say, offering a variety of color options, toy options, things like that.
So good. Yes. Yeah. I think also there's a pitfall where sometimes folks are like, oh, well, I don't want to put ideas in this kid's head, so I'm just going to not talk about gender at all and wait for them somehow to spontaneously just come to me one day and tell me what their gender identity is. And that's also not how things work, right? Like kids decide, I'm stuck on this banana metaphor.
Yeah, that's okay.
I hope it's useful to someone. But also a kid's not going to know if they like bananas or don't like bananas unless they've been given the option to try bananas. And given a little bit of space to be like, do I like it? Do I not like it? I don't know. I think maybe I don't like it. Okay. Well, let me try it one more time. Yeah, no. I definitely don't like it, right? So by providing children with lots of different ways of being, examples, role models in books, in clothing choices, options with toys, by opening that conversation, by talking about our own gender identities as important grown-ups in their lives and what they mean to us, that actually helps kids figure out for themselves who they are and what they like, and have language to describe it.
That's great. I like that. Yeah. So also thinking about how children develop an understanding of gender, how might that be influenced by a child's disability?
Great question. So I think one caveat is I think about disability from a disability justice model that disability isn't something necessarily innate in the individual, but that our society is constructed in ways that reinforce, advantage, and normalize certain ways of being and marginalize other ways of being. And so that's one piece of it. And then another piece is that disability is a huge category. There's so many different types of disability. And so it's hard to speak, specifically in one way that applies to all kids with disabilities. With those two caveats, though, I think that one thing to keep in mind is this developmental timeline is mostly modeled off of typically developing kids, and it is not a rule. So, for example, if your child is 4 years old, but in terms of their cognitive development is more developmentally along the age of a 2-year-old, you might expect the things typical of a 2-year-old rather than a 4-year-old, for example. Or if your child is cognitively a 4-year-old, but they're not super verbal for any reason, you might not expect them to say to you, hi, Mom, I identify as a girl, or hi, Mom, I'm a transgender boy, right? They might communicate to you in other ways other than verbally. So those are a couple of different ways.
Yeah, I think that's a really great answer. I'd also like to throw out a plug. I know you spoke very briefly about the models of disability. INCLUDEnyc actually has a podcast series, and we had a recent podcast episode where we spoke about models of disability. So if you're interested in learning more about models of disability, I would encourage you to check out our podcast series. And there's a podcast in there that relates to that, and they talk for, I think, 45 minutes or so and go really in depth on that. If people want more information about what that means and what that looks like.
I'm going to listen to that. I'm
Good.
Train ride home.
I hope you do. So moving on a little bit, how can gender roles and stereotypes impact a child's growth and self-expression?
Yeah. I would say that the gender binary and sexism and patriarchy, or gender stereotypes in general, are harmful to every human being's development, for every child, whether they are gender conforming or gender non-conforming. these systems of oppression that put us in boxes and say that some ways of being are better than other ways of being are especially not good for people who don't fit inside the boxes.
Yeah.
So for trans and gender nonconforming kids, it's really bad. For women and girls who are told by society, by these messages, that they're less important and less valuable in society than men and boys, that's also not good.
Yeah.
And I would also argue for men and boys who are told that they're more valuable or more normal and more entitled to leadership, for example, than women and girls or trans and gender nonconforming people, it's still not good.
Yeah.
And like one example I think of a lot that comes up, I happen to be married, and I'm married to a guy, a cisgender man, and we talk a lot about emotions. Because turns out to be in a relationship, there's lots of emotions.
Yeah.
Any human relationship, there's lots of emotions. And it can be tricky sometimes as someone who was given lots of space,
Right.
as a cisgender girl, to explore my emotions, to express my emotions, to learn how to name those emotions. Sometimes it's a little bit easier for me in conflict, for example, than it is for him,
Yeah.
who has been given very little space in his entire life to really think about and feel all of his emotions. And so that's one of the ways that kind of patriarchy can be harmful to men and boys. We want all human beings to understand their emotions, to be able to express their emotions and communicate them. So yeah, I would argue that these gender stereotypes are hurtful to just about everybody.
I'd agree. Yeah, I think they are. I think one thing that I sometimes think about is, when I was teaching in the classroom, is trying to be really mindful of if I had a student who identified as a boy and they got upset, to not use the language of saying things like, boys don't cry, man up, little guy, and trying to create space when I was in the classroom for any kid with any gender identity to feel their emotions and honor their emotions and have some time to sort of think and process them.
Yes.
So I think that's one thing that practitioners can think about.
Definitely.
Yeah. So we sort of started talking a little bit about this, but do you have any other specific strategies or tips to combat gender stereotypes that you would want families or professionals to be aware of?
Yeah. So I think sometimes there's a instinct to want to know, like, well, what book do I get?
Right,
like, what show do I buy? Or like, what's the one sentence I can make sure that I say tonight at dinner, and then we'll just be done.
Right.
And it turns out it's way more complicated than that. There are a whole host of strategies written down in your handout packet.
Great.
But the number one strategy that I actually learned from this book, Anti-Bias Education for Young Children and Ourselves, is that the more we engage as grown-ups in our own work about figuring out what gender means to us and how the gender binary and how patriarchy have impacted our lives, the better equipped we are to support young children in doing that same type of exploration. And remembering that it's like an ongoing journey. And so it's actually really good for kids to see us exploring this over time and talking about it in an ongoing way. And remembering that kids learn way more from what we do and how we live our lives than they do from what we say about how we live our lives. And so if they see us with friends and colleagues of all different genders, if they see us consuming media from people of all different genders, if we go to places where people in leadership are of all different genders, when we live into our values, that actually teaches kids a lot more than just the books we read with them or the things that we say to them.
That's a really good answer. I like that answer.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think that's really great.
I think one other thing I would say is it can be helpful when I'm like in a particular situation and I'm like struggling to figure out like how do I move forward, to think about, to really get clear again on what my goals are for kids.
Right.
And a lot of times the framework of anti-bias education can be really helpful for me. And the framework of anti-bias education has 4 core goals. The first goal is that we want every young child to know who they are and feel good about who they are.
Okay.
So to have language to talk about who they are and to feel affirmed and proud of and like really, really know way deep down in their heart, in their soul, in their bones, that they are beautiful and worthy and perfect exactly as they are. The second goal is that we want all kids to know that not everybody is like them.
Right.
That turns out
Yeah.
like we want them to be able to build healthy, equitable relationships with people whose gender is different than theirs.
Yeah.
The third goal is justice. And so that one's really important to me because I think actually we're pretty good at 1 and 2. We could do better. But I think we at least often as professionals and families give ourselves permission to do goals 1 and 2. Sometimes we don't know if we have permission to do goals 3 and 4.
Okay.
And this is me giving everyone permission. Goal 3 about fairness is equipping kids with the skills to name that stuff is unfair.
Okay.
So when you go to the toy aisle and you see there's one whole wall of pink stuff and one whole wall of blue stuff, being able to say, what's up with that?
Yeah.
That's not fair. I don't like that. How do you feel about that? What do you think about that? Why do you think that's happening? Or when you're watching an episode of Paw Patrol and all of the girls stay back and the boys go out on the adventure, you pause the show and you say, hey, I'm noticing something. I noticed that all the boys get to go on the adventure and the girls stay back. That makes me feel angry because I'm a girl and I want to go on adventures. Yeah. What do you think of that? Have you noticed that? And so just naming unfair things in the world is really, really powerful. And then the last one, number 4, is that we can't only name unfair things in the world. We have to feel like we have the agency to do something about it.
Okay.
Because otherwise it can be pretty depressing.
Yeah.
And so the 4th one is activism. It's figuring out, like after you figure that out in Paw Patrol that something's unfair, you go, what can we do about this? Like, I don't know. Should we write a letter to the people at Paw Patrol? Like, okay, let's write a letter and send it to Paw Patrol. Or, you know what, maybe we don't think this is fair. Let's do our own episode. Yeah. You know, and you can hop on YouTube and make costumes and do your own episode of Paw Patrol where things are more fair. But in some way, brainstorming together and taking action to make the world as it should be rather than just accepting the world as it is.
To make it a more just place. I like that.
Mm-hmm.
I like that. It's very fun. I like that.
Yeah. I want kids who can survive the world as it is.
Yeah.
And also I want kids who know that the world as it is doesn't have to be.
The way that it is.
The way that it is, and can trust us as grown-ups that we're working to build a world that is more fair. And when we get there, they're going to be ready to be in that world also.
I really like that. I think that's really great advice. I like that a lot. Sort of staying in the vein of strategies and things.
Yeah.
What are things that families and professionals can do to encourage kids and to sort of build up that kids have comfort and respect for their own body and also for other people's bodies? So I'm thinking about, things like if your child is visiting family and someone says, like, give grandma a kiss, how would you recommend negotiating things like that?
Great question. Especially with the winter holidays coming up. This is a situation that is probably on many people's minds. This question gets at, so we do 3 workshops at the Early Childhood Professional Development Institute. Our first one really focuses on what we've been talking about so far, this gender question.
Yeah.
The second one talks about early childhood sexuality, which really is, actually, and we did another live stream.
Yeah, it's great.
So maybe we can link to that if anyone wants to dive even deeper into this topic. But the early childhood sexuality development question really is all about curiosity and consent and setting boundaries. And this question really touches on that. Like, what are boundaries? How do we help kids really feel a sense of bodily autonomy, that their body is theirs and they are the boss of their bodies, and they get to say to other people what they want and what they don't regarding their bodies. And again, like every situation, there's no one right way. Everybody, every situation is different. And I trust every parent that they know what is best for their kids and they know what is possible in their context. But I'd say in an ideal situation, you get to have a conversation with your kid before you go to someone else's house, for example. and say, hey, usually grandma really likes to give you a kiss on the cheek. And I noticed that sometimes you make a face like this when grandma tries to kiss you on the cheek, which makes me think maybe you don't want grandma to give you a kiss on the cheek. Is that accurate? And then your kid gets to say, oh, no, I really do like a kiss. Or, yeah, I don't like it when she does that. Then you go to go, okay, well, you're the boss of your body. And so what are some things that you can do to tell grandma you don't want to kiss? And how can I have your back as your grown-up? And maybe your kid will say, well, I'm just going to tell grandma no thank you. And then you get to go, great, you can tell grandma no thank you. Or maybe your kid is really shy kid. And they're like, I don't know, can you talk to grandma? Right. And you go, yeah, I've got your back. I will call grandma today and we'll talk about it. And we will have a conversation in advance so grandma will know. And sometimes you don't have tons of time in advance to have that conversation. You just show up at grandma's door and there's grandma, right? With her arms outstretched. And in that situation, sometimes it can be helpful to just slow things down, right? To take a deep breath, to swoop in, to say, hey, grandma, I love hugs. And I know you really want to give our little one a hug, but we're practicing right now. This little one being able to say what they like and what they don't like. So what are some options? Can they give you a kiss? Can they give you a high five? Can they give you a wave? Right. And then if you as the grown-up has slow things down and give some concrete options, sometimes that can help. And as always, remember that the beautiful thing about relationships is that they're ongoing. Right. So if you mess up in one, situation, you always later that day, later that week, even a whole year later, you get to revisit it and be like, oh yeah, I didn't like how that went. What are some ways that we can do it different next time? Yeah, and try again and reset and go from there. Yeah, that's great. So thinking also about encouraging comfort and respect for a child's own body, typically in a school-based setting, what are things that people could think about instead of saying things like boys don't play with that, or these are the costumes for the holiday show, girls are going to wear skirts, and there's a child who says, I don't want to wear a skirt. What are some strategies around those kinds of issues? Yeah. I mean, again, ideally, you're having a proactive conversation. Right. So when you're picking a school or you're picking a preschool, you can interview them and say, hey, how do you approach gender justice? These are some things that I see. These are the values of my family. And so it doesn't have to be reactive in the moment. And also sometimes that's life. You end up in a moment, they're doing a holiday show. You're like, whoa, okay, I have to pick between the tutu costume or the Fire Ranger costume. I don't know what it is. But, and so in that moment, you're like, okay, how am I going to confront this situation? So you might think about first, as a community organizer, I always think about who is in charge. Who has the power to change something that I want to see changed? And so instead of maybe, if I realize it's actually a school-wide policy, yelling at my kid's teacher probably isn't going to change it. That's probably a question that goes to the principal. Yeah. And then also, I can think if my kid happens to be in a New York City Department of Education early childhood program, I can know, there's actually these things called the Transgender Student Guidelines. I can download a PDF of them from the DOE website, and I can go into a meeting with my principal and say, hey, actually, did you know this is against DOE policy? And maybe it will get changed. And then if it doesn't get changed, okay, maybe let me organize with some other teachers, other parents, other children to communicate with the people who are in charge to change the policy. And if all that's not possible, making creative choices in the moment and encouraging as much exploration and play is possible. And really being clear that when we're communicating, this is what's important to me, this is how I feel about it, and why, we're also really coming from a heart place and explaining, these are my values and this is why. So we're not judging other people. I can remember when I was teaching preschool, and it was just standard practice to say, boys and girls, let's line up. Right? And it became such a standard practice because that's how I was taught when I was in school. That's what I saw around me, that it took maybe 6 months or so of really intentional practice. To say, okay, friends, let's line up, and to get rid of that language of boys and girls, boys and girls. And so being patient with ourselves and others as we learn new ways of being that better align with our values. Again, sort of in that vein, so thinking about the language that people use in classrooms or the language that people use in homes,
Are there other things that folks could do either to make their classroom a safer space, to make their home a safer space, or a more inclusive space for kids to explore?
We've touched on so many already.
Yeah, we have.
A strategy I think of is you could do an inventory.
Oh, what a great idea.
Like kind of with your kid.
Yeah.
And say, hey, I watched this really interesting live stream this afternoon.
Yeah.
It was fantastic. There are these wonderful guests brought on by INCLUDEnyc. And I was thinking about gender. I was thinking about stuff that people say is for girls and stuff that people say is for boys. And I noticed there's some things that are unfair. So let's go through our toys and let's see. Or let's go through our books in our home library and let's see what we see. And sort of doing an inventory alongside young kids can be really, really fun. And also really informative because we don't want to assume what kids already know about gender. And so approaching it with a spirit of inquiry and curiosity and saying, hey, what have you noticed?
Right.
What do you think about this? Really helps us like listen to where kids are at and figure out a strategy that's meeting them exactly where they are.
I think you could also do the same thing with your child's clothing.
Yes.
And ask them, are there other colors that you'd like represented? Are there other items that you're interested in wearing? And, looking at different websites and things like that to look at different pictures of children's clothing to figure out, are there other items that they're interested in exploring and trying and seeing what they feel like on their body?
I love that idea.
Yeah. Thank you. And then finally, I know we just have a couple more minutes with you, Megan. So as we're getting into the holidays, people are seeing lots of family, lots of friends. If you do have a child who has gender nonconforming dress or gender nonconforming behavior, what are some strategies if you have family or friends who are having trouble accepting that or making it a little bit more difficult for you and your family? What are some things that people can think about and do?
Yeah, what a great question. So again, this gets back to like our goals for kids. We want our kids both to survive the world as it is and to be ready for a world that is different.
Right.
And so, and again, there's lots of proactive things that we can do by calling our friends and talking to them, sending them resources, like kind of building a world and a community that is safe for our gender expansive child. And there's lots of protective strategies, talking in advance to kids about like, well, in our house or in our school, we know that there's no such thing as girl toys and boy toys and girl clothes and boy clothes. But you may have noticed a lot of people think that they're right. And so let's think together about when someone is confused, what can we say? How can I have your back? How can I support you? Yeah. And really being partners with kids as they make that choice for themselves. I know lots of gender nonconforming kids stories that I've heard about kids in particular, where they're actually really savvy in thinking through like, this is my favorite tutu. I love it. I want to wear it as soon as I get home. I want to wear it to bed. I want to wear it. I know I can wear it at grandma's house, but I don't want to wear it at preschool. Right. And talking to them about, well, how come? Is there something I can do to make school feel like a place where you can wear your favorite tutu? But also knowing that it's not going to change all of a sudden. Right. Like helping, being their ally and going, all right, well, I hope you know that whenever you're ready to wear your purple tutu to school, I support you. Yeah. And, we can even put it in your backpack and you can put it on, if you want to for 5 minutes during free play time. Right. But you don't have to. And like really supporting kids to make decisions about how they want to be in the world in a way that feels safe and affirming. And like trusting that own gut instinct about like, this is a place that is safe for me. This is a place not quite yet. Right. Yeah. I think that's a really, really great example. I think it could also be as simple as if they want to bring the tutu to school, they could keep it in their backpack and they could show it to a friend if that's something that makes them feel happy and safe, but that, just encouraging them to think about what are the things that will make you feel okay with this and how can I, as your parent or your teacher or another professional who's working with you, how can I support you through that? I think that's great.
We actually have a few more minutes. So I think one of the things that we didn't get a chance to hit on is we talked a little bit about strategies for at school, for visiting family. We didn't talk at all about strategies in terms of medical or clinical settings. And I know we spoke about how biological sex is typically determined in a medical type setting. So what are strategies around that to encourage gender expansiveness or to support a child who is gender expansive in those kinds of settings?
Yeah. Again, proactive strategies would be super helpful.
Right.
And I think the more that we find doctors and other medical providers who are gender literate,
right,
the better.
Yeah.
And more there are those doctors. And so I think taking the time to find one that can really work with your family in a way that feels affirming is the ideal. But also knowing that's not the case for everybody.
Right.
Not everybody has access yet to doctors and medical facilities that are gender literate and ready to support gender expansive kids and families. And so in those settings, being the grown up and really knowing it's your job to advocate for your kid. And so having those proactive conversations, protecting your child as much as possible, providing language and saying in advance to the doctor certain things, and then preparing your kid for what they might expect when they go to the doctors, and helping them understand that they're not wrong. The doctor's confused. And the doctor's confused because probably when they went to school, people thought these things.
Right.
So
Yeah.
They got some misinformation, and so the doctor's wrong, but you're not wrong. There's absolutely nothing wrong with you. We love you exactly the way that you are. Yeah.
I think that's a really strong message for all kids, that we love you just the way you are. And I think that's, a really great message. So thank you so much for being here. I had such a good time talking with you, Megan. And I really appreciate your time. I think this was a super helpful, super informative conversation. So I really thank you for taking the time to come out and talk with us today. I'd also like to remind everybody that the handouts that we referred to earlier are down below if you scroll down a little bit. I believe Megan's contact information is in there as well. If you want to get in touch, there's also some information for how to get in touch with Include if you have questions for us. And don't forget to check out our website. There are additional resources coming up. There are some workshops. There's another live stream next month on Thursday. And also the past live stream that we had with Megan is also available online if you'd like to take a peek at that. And so thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you have a wonderful holiday season, and thank you again to Megan for being our guest today.
Thank you so much for having me. And for doing the important work that you do every single day, professionally at INCLUDEnyc, and also for the work that you do as a parent.
Thank you.
And thank you all. Thanks for being awesome parents in the world.
Yeah, thanks for watching, guys.